Welcome to the second event of this semester in our Global Japan Speaker Series. Our program today is titled Before BRI, Japan's Overseas Development Assistance. And we have an outstanding speaker on this topic. I'm Bruce Aronson, head of the Japan Center at the U.S. Asia Law Institute of NYU School of Law, and also an adjunct professor at the law school. And I will be the moderator today. For today's program, I am delighted to welcome a leading expert on Japan's ODA, or Overseas Development Assistance Policy, Professor Hiroaki Shiga of the Graduate School of International Social Sciences at Yokohama National University. His research centers on development cooperation strategy. He has experience working in virtually every relevant agency in Japan, the Overseas Economic Cooperation Fund, Japan Bank for International Cooperation, Japan International Cooperation Agency, or JICA, and the Ministry of Finance of Japan. The results of his research have been published in leading international academic journals and also research institutions. Professor Shiga is a graduate of the University of Tokyo and has a Master of International Affairs from SIPA, the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. So today we have an important and timely topic. Everyone has heard of China's BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, to finance infrastructure in developing countries to help connect trade. Fewer people are aware of Japan's ODA, despite its longer history and significant impact. Beginning in the 1950s, Japan's ODA has been an important instrument for Japanese diplomacy. Its initial focus on economic development in Asia was characterized as being both non-military and non-political. However, this Cold War strategy has evolved over the past 2 decades, in large part due to the rise of China, to include both national security challenges and the promotion of universal values. Among the questions to be discussed today are, how, in fact, does Japan incorporate national security concerns into its ODA policy? And how will Japanese ODA policy respond to the current challenge of striking a balance between promoting universal values and avoiding offense to recipient governments? And finally, can Japan somehow play a role as a special ambassador to the global South? Our program today is 60 minutes. We will hear opening remarks from the speaker and then enter into what I expect will be a free-flowing discussion. We will respond to as many audience questions as possible. Please use the Q&A icon to send us questions. The chat function will not be operating. So let's begin. It's already 11 p.m. in Tokyo time. So a very warm welcome and thanks to Professor Shiga for joining us. Hiroaki, please go ahead with your opening remarks.
Okay, Professor Aronson, thank you very much for your very kind introduction. It is my great honor and pleasure to attend this event, and I would like to thank Professor Aronson again for inviting me. So the purpose of my opening remarks is to provide an introduction to the discussion which I would conduct with Professor Aronson about the problems that Japan's ODA policy now faces and how Japan seeks to address them in the context of the deepening geopolitical confrontation among the great powers. So to this end, I would like to present some basic facts about Japanese ODA. That is 3 characteristics of Japanese ODA. So first is that Japan, as you know, Japan is one of the largest ODA providers. Japan was the largest donor between 1989 and 1996, and it's still the 4th largest donor, only after the United States, United Kingdom, and Germany, despite 3 decades of economic stagnation. And second, Japan's ODA has long focused on supporting infrastructure development through loans. It is called yen loans or enshakan in Japanese, to facilitate economic growth of the recipient countries. The share of loans in total ODA amount varies from year to year, but at its highest, it is about 70%. So this makes Japan's ODA quite unique among the 31 ODA donor countries that belongs to the Development Assistance Committee of the OECD. And third is the non-political and non-military nature of Japanese ODA. In other words, Japan has carefully avoided involvement in the domestic politics and military affairs of the recipient countries. This means a reticent approach to ODA for the promotion of so-called universal values, such as liberal democracy, the rule of law, and respect for human rights, and no military assistance. So these characteristics, especially the second, emphasis on infrastructure, and the third, non-political and non-military nature, are based on Japan's consistent foreign policy since the 1950s up until today of using ODA strategically for Japan's own economic development. This is reflected in the fact that Japanese government has long called its ODA as economic cooperation or keizai kyōryoku in Japanese, and ODA policy making had been made mainly not by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs but by MITI, the Ministry of Trade and Industry, Tsusansho in Japanese, up until 1980s. So when Japan began providing aid in 1954, it was only 9 years after its defeat in the World War II. Its aid was not aid in its real sense of the word, if we define aid as a kind of endeavor to provide goods and services from rich countries to poor countries. So Japan at the time was, needless to say, it was a war-devastated poor countries and needed the markets and resources of newly independent developing countries in Asia for its economic recovery. So therefore, it was necessary for Japan to avoid getting involved in domestic politics of recipient countries and making the leaders and governments of these countries uncomfortable and angry. So this was the reason why Japan decided to provide infrastructure assistance, which was strongly desired by the governments of recipient countries, and to promote Japan's image as a peaceful nation or a peace-loving nation by avoiding military aid. Thus, large-scale infrastructure assistance has been provided, mainly to East Asian and Southeast Asian countries in which Japanese companies were interested. And infrastructure development contributed to the improvement of investment environment in these countries, which incentivized many Japanese leading companies to conduct a foreign direct investment into these countries. And aid to Asian countries has accounted for nearly 80% of the total amount of ODA for decades. And in addition, up until the 1980s, more than 80% of Japanese ODA was tied aid. Tied aid is a type of ODA that is provided under the condition that goods and services necessary for the implementation of ODA project should be procured only from Japanese companies. However, with the end of the Cold War, the third characteristics, namely non-political nature of ODA, came to experience a change. So as values such as liberal democracy, the rule of law, human rights came to be regarded as universal values after the demise of the socialist regimes in the Soviet Union and in Eastern European countries. A promotion of such values in the former socialist countries and developing countries came to be regarded as a common diplomatic goals of Western countries, and Japan started to provide ODA for the promotion of universal values in early 1990s. And importantly, however, the point is that Japan has not changed the policy of carefully avoiding antagonizing the leaders and governments of recipient countries. So more concretely speaking, Japan never provided ODA to opposing parties, independent media, and anti-government NGOs, in clear contrast to the ODA by the United States. Japan provides democracy assistance only when it is requested by the recipient government and its nature is purely technical, like the assistance for the smooth implementation of elections. And now we are entering the era of great power rivalry because of the rise of China. And it is an era in which China's military threat is increasing, and Japan's security environment is deteriorating dramatically. So I must stop here. And from now on, I would like to make a discussion with Professor Aronson about how Japanese ODA policy is changing in a changing environment. So thank you very much for your attention.
Oh, thank you, Hiro. And if you're Hiro, then please call me Bruce. So your very excellent overview of Japanese ODA focused primarily on financial aid for infrastructure. I know, though, that Japanese ODA has a wide variety of components. Could you also tell us a little bit about the people-to-people aspect of Japanese ODA?
Okay, Aronson, Bruce, thank you very much for raising a very important point. Japanese ODA consists of various components, and I only mentioned to the yen loan financing for the infrastructure development. But it consists not only of yen loan financing, but technical assistance, grants, invitation of foreign students by providing scholarship, and also the dispatch of JOCV, Japan Overseas Volunteer Corps, which is quite similar to US Volunteer Corps. And because of the competition of rather complex composition of Japanese ODA, it is very difficult for me to describe the holistic picture of Japanese ODA policies. So I emphasize that Japanese ODA is unique in the sense that it provides ODA loan financing, yen loan financing for the infrastructure development. But at the same time, we are providing various kinds of technical assistance for the promotion of good governance, education, public health, and so on and so forth. So it is very difficult to say that Japan is only interested in infrastructure development. So that is my point.
Okay, so I take it that you described briefly the origins of Japanese ODA policy in the 1950s. So from the beginning, there was an emphasis more on infrastructure development that would be welcomed by recipient countries, and at the same time, also act as a spur to Japanese industry for trade and investment. And you characterize it as being non-military and non-political. As a historical footnote, it's curious to me that given the difficult relations between Japan and China, and also to some extent Japan and Korea, isn't it accurate to say that Japanese ODA was a very significant element in their development for Korea in the 1960s and China in the 1970s and 80s? Would that be a fair characterization?
Okay, thank you very much. So generally speaking, it is very difficult to demonstrate or measure the impact of ODA for the recipient country's economic development, and China and Japan's ODA toward China and Korea is not an exception. But I can safely say that Japanese ODA has made a significant contribution to the infrastructure development in these two countries, which contributed to the economic growth of both countries. So please let me give an example about China. So since 1979, the total amount of nearly 24 billion US dollar in Japanese 3兆3600億円 of ODA was provided mainly for the infrastructure development to these countries. And many projects were devoted for the infrastructure in communication, in electricity, and transportation. And without doubt, this infrastructure development via Japanese ODA contributed significantly to the improvement of environmental investment environment in these countries. And because of that, many foreign companies, leading companies, including Japanese ones, were incentivized to make an FDI in these countries. So we can say that the Japanese ODA made a contribution to the economic development of these countries by way of the improvement of investment environment. So that is my answer.
Well, I note that at the time, neither of these countries were democracies. At the time that there was a substantial amount of aid. So it was this sort of Cold War version, non-military and non-political form of ODA. Even though you mentioned it's hard to measure, nevertheless, was it considered to be a success in Japan and elsewhere?
Yes. So again, it is very difficult to judge whether or not it is a success or not, because in order to make that kind of judgment, some criteria for that judgment is indispensable. But yeah, again, I can say that it is a success in the sense that it has contributed to the improvement of the investment environment through infrastructure development, and that encouraged Japanese companies to expand its operation overseas. So at least in that sense, it can be considered as largely a success.
So you mentioned that due to kind of changes in the environment, including new competition with China, that over the last decade or so, Japan's ODA policy has evolved and now includes more of a national security component. Many of us have an image of the Japanese people as being rather pacifist, with well-known Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution. Is it your sense that people of Japan fully accept this new national security element in Japan's ODA? And what kind of projects, can you point to some specific examples of how national security is now being incorporated into Japan's ODA?
Okay, thank you very much. So you kindly asked me two questions. As regards to the perception of Japanese general public towards the tendency of Japanese ODA to be utilized more for the achievement of Japanese national security goals, I would say that it is generally accepted, mainly because many Japanese people are keenly aware of the security threat imposed by China. So that's the reason why I would say that it is generally accepted. And as regards to the examples of security-related ODA project, it is the provision of patrol vessels to the coast guards of many Asian countries like Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia. So needless to say, all these countries have territorial conflict with China in the South China Sea. And the purpose of these Japanese ODA for the construction of patrol vessels to be given to the coast guard of these countries is to enhance the capacity of these countries' coast guard to cope with the encroachment of Chinese coast guard. And at the same time, another objective of this kind of security-related ODA is to improve Japan's own national security environment via the enhancement of the capacity of Coast Guard of so-called like-minded countries that share the common security concerns vis-a-vis China.
Okay. So that's the national security aspect. I'd also like to touch upon the political aspect. You mentioned that in the post-Cold War environment, Japan also feels a need to promote universal values. At the same time, you also mentioned that Japan tends to not interfere with domestic politics of recipient countries. So in what way then does Japan promote universal values under current ODA policy? What sort of values would those be?
Okay, so as you rightly said, Japan is now facing the challenge of striking a right balance between a kind of realism in face of the great power competition and the necessity to promote the so-called universal values. And it is very important for Japanese ODA policy. And it is the biggest challenge for Japanese ODA policy. And it seems to me that Japanese government is trying to strike this very delicate balance by shifting the actual contents of universal values from the universal values in the domestic scenery of recipient countries like liberal democracy, human rights, and rule of law to the international, this is the point, international rule of law. So one of the indication is the FOIP initiative, Free and Open Initiative. To be sure, the FOIP initiative is emphasizing the importance of upholding universal values. But when it comes to the actual contents of universal values, its emphasis is not on the domestic universal values like liberal democracy in Vietnam, liberal democracy in the Philippines, but the international rule of law. And it means that the endeavor of a certain country to change the international status quo by force must be deterred. And in order to achieve that strategic goal, as I told you, Japan has started to provide security-related ODA for the enhancement of the capacity of the Coast Guard of various Southeast Asian countries that has a territorial problem with China. So that is my observation about how Japan is trying to strike a right balance between the upholding of universal values and the realistic consideration to achieve its national security.
So as a reminder to our audience, FOIP is the Free and Open Indo-Pacific, which was a major policy of the Abe administration. So support for the international rule of law and freedom of the seas, I suppose, as opposed to domestic human rights issues. Well, I think we're going to return to that in a little bit when we start talking about the global South. But before we get to that, I would also like to ask about a so-called human security aspect of Japanese ODA. Probably the best known individual in Japan in connection with ODA is Sadako Ogata, who was formerly the UN High Commissioner for Refugees and also president of JICA, Japan International Cooperation Agency. She was known for emphasizing human security. Can you tell us a little bit about what it is and how it fits in with Japanese ODA?
Okay, thank you very much. And as you rightly said, Miss Sadako Ogata, late Miss Ogata Sadako, was an icon for the promotion of human security. But actually, she became the president of JICA in 2001, if I'm not mistaken. But it was after 1994 that Japan officially adopted human security, the achievement of human security, as one of the most critical goals for Japanese ODA provision. And here, human security is a kind of approach to addressing the vulnerability of individuals and communities, emphasizing their safety, dignity, and well-being. And even under the severe security environment now Japan is facing vis-a-vis China, Japanese policy, ODA policy of upholding human security as one of the important goals remains unchanged. And one of the illustration is that Japanese government revised the Development Cooperation Charter last year. So Development Cooperation Charter is one of the most important policy document by the Japanese government that stipulates what is Japanese ODA's major goals, what is the philosophies, and what are the strategic objectives and goals, that kind of things. And it was firstly adopted in 1992, and it was revised for several times. And lastly, it was revised in last year. And still, this development cooperation charter emphasizes that Japan continues to make a commitment to the enhancement of human security via Japanese ODA. But my worry is that, yes, it is written in the Development Cooperation Charter. Still, it is an official Japanese government policy to uphold human security. But as I told you, Japanese ODA is now experiencing, which I call the securitization of ODA. By saying securitization of ODA, it is a tendency of donor countries to provide ODA, mainly for the achievement of its national security goals. And it is not limited to Japan. It is an rather widely observed phenomena among so-called Western countries. But in this, in the face of the trend for the securitization of ODA, it is my concern that Japan would provide bigger amount of ODA, securitized ODA, at the sacrifice of ODA intended to support the human security. So that is the Japanese government policy toward human security, and it's my assessment for the future in that regards.
Thank you. Could you give us an example of the kind of projects that that would fit within Japan's ODA policy with respect to human security?
Yes, yeah, there are a bunch of examples. One of the category is that the technical assistance for the promotion of the gender equality or the public health for the marginalized people, that kind of things. And again, I emphasize that Japanese government has been emphasizing the infrastructure development via ODA, but at the same time, JICA has a bunch of activities. So still, even though we are experiencing a securitization of ODA, a significant number of ODA projects for the upholding of security, human security is now being conducted.
Okay. Well, let me return for a moment to the title of our talk, Before BRI. So your emphasis on infrastructure development within Japan's ODA sounds quite similar to the goals of China's BRI. So how would you compare and contrast China's BRI with Japan's ODA, both historically and today?
Okay, thank you very much for raising a very important point. As you rightly said, there are some commonalities among BRI and FOI, Belt and Road Initiative by China and Free and Open Pacific Initiative by Japan, in the sense that both initiatives are emphasizing the importance of infrastructure connectivities. And in addition, Japanese ODA is quite similar to Chinese aid in the sense that both countries are putting emphasis on infrastructure development. So it means that Japanese government is now faced with the need to clarify its comparative advantage vis-a-vis Chinese aid. And in terms of, in order to achieve this goal, Japanese government is now emphasizing the key phrase, quality infrastructure. This implies that infrastructure development by Japanese ODA has higher quality compared to that by China. And another Japanese government endeavor to make our comparative advantage clear is the fact that Japanese government led the adoption of G20 principles for responsible infrastructure investment in the G20 meetings convened in Osaka in 1219. So these principles emphasize the importance of paying due attention to debt sustainability and environmental sustainability when donor countries would provide ODA for the infrastructure development. So that is the a commonality of Chinese aid and Japanese aid, Belt and Road Initiative and FOIP, and how Japan is coping with that commonalities.
Okay, so when you say quality, we're concerned mainly about sustainability then. And
Yes,
that's
environmental sustainability and debt sustainability. And when it comes to the issue of debt sustainability, it is becoming an urgent issue for several recipient countries. And some countries, like Sri Lanka or Zambia, go bankruptcy because of the accumulation of debt. And donor countries, including Japan and China, all more required to pay due attention to the debt sustainability of recipient countries. And of course, it is addressed toward China, but Japan is not an exception. And when it comes to Sri Lanka, the debt amount is accumulated not only by China, but also Japan and Asian Development Bank and also India. And when it comes to Japanese aid and Chinese aid, its amount is nearly the same. So both are contributing to 10% of the total amount of debt accumulated by Sri Lanka. So this principle is addressed not only for China, but also for Japan.
I see. Well, I know you were in Sri Lanka last week, so maybe the Matabari Port project there is a good example. So we're wondering, historically, we talk about Japan as being non-political, non-military, and only undertaking projects that are welcomed by the recipient country. At the same time, we talk about a stronger national security element. So how would you characterize it, just as an example, how would you characterize the motivations for this project in Sri Lanka? I presume that the main motivation is still infrastructure development on behalf of Sri Lanka, and any competition with China or opportunities for Japanese businesses to trade and invest, I presume would still be secondary motivations. Would that be an accurate description?
Yes, I think so. Of course, we continue to pay due attention to the enhancement of the interest of Japanese companies. And at the same time, we try to pay due attention to the economic development of the recipient countries. And Matabari Seaport, a deep sea port project, I suppose it is not in Sri Lanka, but in Bangladesh.
I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah, no. And it is requested by the Bangladesh government. Originally, it was China that tried to make a finance on that project, but Bangladesh government rejected, and in turn, it forwarded its request to JICA, and JICA accepted that offer and decided to provide an ODA financing to the development of that port. And its Japanese consideration is multiple. So one is the promotion of Japanese interest of Japanese companies that want to make its business expanded into that country. And the other is, of course, the strategic consideration. So deep sea port can be a very important foothold for navies. And so far, Japan has no plan to dispatch the vessels of Japan Maritime Defense Force, but still, potentially, it can be worked as a very strategically important port. And I think that is another Japanese motivation for providing ODA to that port development project.
I see. So there is a stronger national security element, but
Yes.
in your view, does that make a big difference? Is this the kind of project that would have been done 20 or 30 years ago anyway? And we're just more aware of national security issues, or have national security issues actually had a strong impact on what sort of projects are undertaken and how they're accomplished?
Yes, yeah, you are right in saying that Japanese government are more inclined to pay attention to the national security of Japan. And JICA, because JICA is a Japanese government branch to implement Japanese ODA policy, and JICA is accordingly inclined to pay more attention to the strategic goals of Japanese national security.
Okay. Why don't we move on? One of the questions that we had was this idea that Japan could somehow be a better representative or bridge to the global South compared to a country like the United States. And as I recall, that notion is even included in the Development Cooperation Charter that you mentioned before. What makes Japan more qualified than other countries like the United States to serve as an ambassador to the global South?
Okay, well, I don't believe that Japan is more qualified to attract the support from the countries of global South compared to Western countries, including the United States. But maybe Japanese ODA policy of respecting the ownership of recipient countries may work to attract the support from the countries of the global South, because respecting the ownership means that we do not preach, we do not impose values such as liberal democracy, the rule of law, human rights, and it may be a kind of comparative advantage in procuring the support from the countries of the global South. And one of the indications is that I would say that Japanese government is now keenly aware of the importance of procuring support from the global South countries. And its manifestation is that the latest version of Development Cooperation Charter, which previously emphasized the importance of promotion of universal values, erased that phrase, the promotion of universal values, in last year. It means that Japanese government Japanese government now understand that among the global South countries, universal values are not necessarily universally accepted. And in order to attract the support from several countries of the global South, where the political regime is autocratic, Japanese government are more inclined to pay due attention, not to antagonize the leaders of such countries.
Okay, so universal values are not necessarily universal. With respect to the global South, is the new emphasis on international rule of law and freedom of the seas, is that widely accepted?
When it comes to the international rule of law, I would say that compared to the domestic universal values, it has much broader support among the global South countries, including autocratic countries such as Vietnam, Cambodia, and so on and so forth. But of course, they are just entrapped between China and the United States, Japan, and Western countries. So in their support for the international universal values or the freedom of navigation, that kind of things, some countries are quite reticent to demonstrate their apparent support for such kind of values.
Okay. Just a couple more questions and then I'll open it up to the audience. So what about China policy? In the United States these days, it seems there's competition to be more against China than anyone else. In Japan and also in Korea, I sense there's somewhat more of a balance, that there's a stronger recognition that economic ties with China are also quite important. Do you see a difference in how the balance between national security and economic relations is formed in Japan versus the United States?
Well, I would say that at least when it comes to the policies adopted by late Shinzo Abe and Kishida Fumio, I cannot see any significant difference between Japanese policy and US policy in striking a balance between competition and cooperation. I'm arguing because Japanese government are emphasizing the importance of military build-up, and in that endeavor, Abe administration introduced many, I would say, from his viewpoint, many reforms in Japanese security policy, including the recognition of the 集団的自衛権 collective self-defense, the right of collective self-defense, which had been regarded as unconstitutional. Yeah, or the expansion of military budget, and Kishida administration committed to the United States government that Japan would expand its military budget in order to meet the NATO criteria of 2% of its GDP for the to be allocated to the defense budget. So Japan made such an commitment to the United States before making a discussion in Japanese national diet. So these kind of things are the evidence of Japanese government's emphasis on confrontation and competition, not cooperation. So I hope that Mr. Ishiba, the new prime minister, would strike a right balance between cooperation and competition, and make a difference between Japan and the United States.
Okay, so that leads to my final question, I guess. We have new administrations in both Japan and the United States. So what's your best guess, or what's your hope for how ODA policy may evolve under an Ishiba administration needing to deal with a Trump administration?
Yeah. Okay, so the point I would like to emphasize is that Ishiba administration would not change ODA policy significantly. But if Trump administration would withdraw its commitment to the security in the Indo-Pacific region, it means that Japan is more inclined or more incentivized or even obliged to strengthen the relationship with like-minded countries in the East Asian countries, like Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia. It means that Japan is more obliged to securitize its ODA. So in that regards, the change or the further acceleration of the securitization of ODA would be brought about by the Trump administration's policy vis-a-vis Indo-Pacific and Japanese government response to Trump administration's diplomacy. So that is my assessment so far.
Okay. Well, thank you. It's time to turn to some questions from our online audience. The first question is about Japanese law and legal system and support for legal infrastructure under ODA, which, after all, we have an audience mainly of lawyers, so I guess I should have asked that from the beginning. What's your thought on the part of the ODA that tries to build up legal infrastructure and rule of law in recipient countries? And do you think that's a worthwhile effort?
Okay, thank you very much for raising a very interesting point. And the point that I would like to emphasize is that to be sure, I said that Japanese government has been very reticent in providing ODA for the promotion of universal values. And of course, universal values include the rule of law. But it does not necessarily mean that Japanese government never provided aid for the promotion of the rule of law in the recipient countries. Quite the contrary, Japan is quite eager to provide the ODA for the promotion of the rule of law, mainly in East Asian countries. But the difference of Japanese ODA policy for the promotion of rule of law compared to that of the United States, United Kingdom, and other Western countries is that Japan is promoting the rule of law, not for the facilitation of human rights or that kind of thing, but emphasis is more placed on the economic development. So Japanese government argues that by promoting the rule of law, economic development would be facilitated. So it is quite similar to the Professor Daron Asimoglu's argument that institution matters. So inclusive institutions, if the country which has inclusive institutions, then the country would be successful in being more prosperous. And Japanese government, the argument is quite similar to Professor Asimoglu's argument. And that's the reason why we put an emphasis on the legal system for the enhancement of uh, private contract, provision of level playing field for economic entrepreneurs, that kind of things. And we put an emphasis on private laws such as civil code or civil procedural code and so on and so forth. So that is my assessment.
Okay. I take it that recipient countries are more welcoming of rule of law when it's phrased as promoting economic development than when it's emphasized as promoting human rights.
Yeah. So it is another Japanese government endeavor to eschew being involved in the domestic affairs by emphasizing the aspect of rule of law related to human rights, liberal democracy, and so on and so forth. And again, here comes the non-political nature of Japanese ODA. So Japanese government is carefully choosing the aspect of rule of law that has no political repercussions and connotations.
So that might contribute further to its competitive advantage, maybe. Okay, thank you. Next question. Can you provide some examples of major infrastructure projects assisted by Japan outside of Korea and China? What is the largest project currently in progress?
Yes, it is without doubt the largest project for infrastructure development is the construction project of Shinkansen or bullet train in India. And I'm sorry, I don't have the exact figure of the amount of ODA, but it is, I would say that it is extravagant amount. And it is mainly for the facilitation of Japanese economic interest. So, as you know, the Abe administration put an emphasis on the economic rehabilitation of Japanese economy, so recovery of Japanese economy, and he tried to utilize ODA for the promotion of Japanese business interest, and we lost competitiveness, industrial competitiveness in various fields of but still the bullet train is one of the rare remaining areas that Japanese companies are maintaining comparative advantage. But still, it is now facing the threat from China, because China is now very active in promoting its adoption of China type bullet train in many countries. And we competed with China in Indonesia, and we failed. And the next big project is India. So we made a great effort to take that beat, and we were successful. And that's the reason why we are providing so much amount of money for the construction of bullet train from Gujarat to Ahmedabad. If I'm not mistaken, it is quite near to the Mr. Modi's electoral base. And we are now trying to complete the first phase of the construction of that project. So that is the biggest infrastructure project that JICA is now dealing with.
I see. So I think many of us had heard of China's success in Indonesia. So in the case of India, then, does JICA's large involvement in this project, therefore lower the financing costs for the recipient country? Is that part of the issue here?
Yeah, that's right. So, as you know, Indian government is a very tough negotiator, and they requested us to make the financial conditions as soft as possible. So we are obliged to compromise in that regard. And I'm sorry, again, I don't have the right exact figure, but its interest rate and repayment period, grace period is, I think it's very favorable compared to those of Chinese financing. Maybe it is quite extremely low, like 0.75% interest rate, and its repayment period would be 40 years with a grace period of 10 years. That kind of things. I'm sorry, I may be mistaken, but that is the very common soft conditions in terms of Japanese ODA loan financing for infrastructure development.
Yes, that sounds very low in terms of
Yes,
interest.
it is one of the most the softest terms and conditions.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let's move on to the next question. Interesting to hear Japan's part in Sri Lanka's foreign debt is 10%. Any idea how much of Pakistan's foreign debt belongs to Japan as compared to 30% with China?
In terms of Pakistan, I'm sorry, again, I don't have the exact number, but in terms of Pakistan, the financing amount of China is much, much bigger than that of Japan, because Japan has been obliged to be reticent to provide ODA financing because of the very bad economic and political situation of that country. And Ministry of Finance of Japan is quite influential in deciding Japanese ODA policy. And that ministry is increasingly reticent to provide ODA loans, especially towards the countries with very deteriorating economic situations. In other words, the country with bad debt records, debt repayment records, and that country has a long history of default, rescheduling, and that kind of things. So that's the reason why the Japanese government, especially the Ministry of Finance, is quite reticent in providing ODA to that country. And that is the reason why the significant difference of amount provided by China and by Japan.
So is that just one example, or does that represent a significant difference in approach between Japan and China?
Excuse me, could you please repeat your question?
Sorry. So Pakistan is one example, but does that represent a different approach generally between Japan and China with respect to what kind of recipient countries they're willing to provide ODA assistance to?
Yes. Chinese government seems to be active. I would say active or more inclined to provide its aid, even though the recipient country is in a very bad economic situation, even though that country has accumulated significant amount of debt to other credit providers. But according to one of my colleagues who are very, who is very accustomed, who is very knowledgeable about Chinese ODA policy, Chinese government is now becoming to change its course. Previously, they provided as much amount of ODA possible, aid possible to recipient countries. But now, Chinese economy is not in a good mood, and that obliges Chinese government to be more selective in choosing the recipient of its aid. and they are now eager to learn from Japan how to be attentive to the data sustainability. So the point is that at the government and government level, at the leaders and leaders level, it seems very confrontational. But on the ground, between JICA and Chinese counterpart, there is a sustainable intercourse between them. And Chinese government is very eager to learn from Japan in terms of how to provide ODA, how to pay due attention to environmental sustainability, how to pay due attention to the debt sustainability, that kind of thing. So they are quite eager to learn from JICA. And that kind of connection is maintained continuously, even though there is a fluctuation of relationship between China and Japan at a very high level.
I see. Well, that's a very interesting point that I think many of us are not aware of, the kind of working level continuing cooperation
Yes,
in
yes.
Japan and China. So I take it that, I don't know about Pakistan particularly, but some of the outstanding debts from China might be somewhat old, and China is then cutting back a little bit in more recent years. Okay. One more question. It sounds like some countries like Bangladesh would prefer Japanese aid to Chinese aid. If so, what would be the reasons for that?
Okay. Well, I never asked that question to the Bangladesh officials, but I guess that Japanese aid is more user-friendly in the sense that Japan does not Japan does not impose conditions. And in contrast, Chinese government required the recipient government to procure from Chinese companies. And in contrast, Japan, previously we requested the recipient government to procure only from Japanese companies, but we changed that policy significantly at the beginning of 1990s. And that continues up until today. And of course, it depends on the project by project, and Abe administration tries to reintroduce the tide aid. But when it comes to Bangladesh, many Japanese ODA financing for infrastructure development still remains untied. And I think it is more convenient for the Bangladeshi government to utilize it because tide aid tends to be more costly because procurement is limited to Japanese companies and competition is conducted only among Japanese companies, which makes its bidding price higher and higher. But when it comes to international competitive bidding under untied ODA, it would reduce the project cost significantly. So I think that is the reason why Bangladeshi government prefer Japanese ODA than Chinese aid.
Thank you very much for reminding us. Some of us still have an old image of Japanese ODA from the Cold War back in the days of MITI rather than METI, when Japanese aid was tied. So that's a very timely reminder that that generally is no longer the case. Well, unfortunately, we've reached our time. So I would like to thank our speaker, Professor Hiroaki Shiga, for a very wonderful conversation. I certainly learned a lot, and I hope people in the audience did as well. So I look forward to seeing everyone again next time. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you very much for a very precious event. Thank you very much.
And we will have a recording of the event on our YouTube channel soon for your friends and neighbors who have missed this session. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Goodbye.